in the, like right after the Ice Age, and that bone was found in Antioch. And the story of it is great because it was found in the early 60s when Antioch didn't have village garbage service yet, and a local resident was actually at the dump dropping off his garbage for the week, and he and a friend were there in a truck, and as they were pushing the garbage off their truck, the man, who was an amateur archaeologist, noticed just a little bit of this vertebrae poking up from the ground and went after it and actually found other fossilized mammoth bones too, and talked to the owner of the dump and got him to stop operations while they tried to salvage these fossilized bones. They were only able, it was slippery because it's a dump, but they were only able to actually manage to get a hold of one, and the man had stopped operations for an hour, and after an hour he said, "I appreciate that you like it, but it is a business, so now we're going to start doing everything again." So the rest of the mammoth is still buried where it was, which at the moment is now beneath the football fields for Antioch High School, because eventually the dump got filled in and added over. So after that, we're going to go from the Ice Age to a little bit closer to now. And these, although they look not that exciting, are actually really cool, and they are one of the most fun things that archaeologists can find when they're digging up sites that people have lived at. All of those are clay pipe fragments. Each of them, these two go together, these two go together, these two go together, and they were pipes for smoking tobacco, and you find them in early houses in the area, and even colonial houses. And one of the cool things about them is because they were clay, they were stamped with the maker and where it came from and different designs. So you know where the people bought the pipes, and you can even date them, because as the technology got better, the size of the stem of the pipe got thinner because they were able to make it more. So even if you just find little fragments, archaeologists are able to date them, and it gives you a good idea of what time people were living in the, oops, sorry, that went one too fast. Let me go back for a second, in the place. And these were all found at a farm in Warren Township, which is right up by Gurnee. So it was left over from people who were living in a log cabin and just beginning to settle Lake County at the time. And although the cabin is gone and most of all the other evidence of being inhabited is gone, the pipe fragments are there. And there are actually 3 different dates. So you can tell not just that people lived there and where they came from and where they bought their pipes, but how long they were living there, because they were living there long enough for the pipe fragments to change. Okay, well, they weren't always living here. And when we talk about people settling Lake County, we are talking about anywhere from about the 1820s, you came in a little early, to a lot of things going on in the 1830s. And most of the people coming here were coming from the East Coast, from New York or Pennsylvania. And prior to that, in this area, they'd come from all over, but we actually had a lot of German settlement. And that includes the people who brought this spinning wheel. They originally came from Germany to Pennsylvania, and they brought this with them on the ship. And if you can imagine, it's big. It comes nearly up to my shoulders when I stand next to it. It's called a walking wheel because you don't actually sit while you're spinning, you walk back and forth as the wheel goes. And after they were in Pennsylvania for 2 years, they actually put that on a wagon and brought it out to Deerfield. These were from some early settlers in Deerfield. And we like thinking about, you know, the things that you feel were most important to pack if you were coming across an ocean and then across half a country. And so you sort of have the practical, because you were going to need, the practical, because you were going to need everything. And again, an example of the practical. This was another thing that was brought over by a German immigrant. It's a little bit larger than it looks. It is an entire shoemaker's kit. And so this was not only the man's profession, it's about the size of a giant toolbox, if you imagine that, but was also something people would have in common and in their own house for making and repairing shoes, because if you didn't have a shoemaker in the area, you needed to be able to do it yourself. And this one has everything for the whole family. You can see the 3 sizes, actually the 4 sizes of shoe lasts, from the smallest to the largest. So you could make shoes for the children, the adults, and whoever's got the largest feet in the family. This too was brought over by a German immigrant who used it to make money, and then also used it just to repair his own family's shoes once again, in Deerfield. Oops, sorry, one second. This was important to not just one immediate family, but what you're looking at there is a wedge. It's that was used in an early lumber mill on the Des Plaines River. And that's one of the things that's funny to think about now, because we think of the Des Plaines River as, you know, maybe for canoeists, or at the moment if it's flooding. But at the time, it was, when people were settling Lake County, it was still a mode of transportation, and it was actually a mode of industry. There were 2 islands in it still. It's changed a lot since then, but there were 2 islands, and they ran sawmills, so that if you were building a house, you could in fact do a log cabin, but the sawmill was there so that you could get the logs turned into boards, and this was used at one of those early mills. We talk about the practical. I also wanted to talk about the precious. So this Bible is in German, and this was brought by an 1840 settler that came to Buffalo Grove, and has been used and handed down in their family ever since. And so it was one of the other things that was important to people, and it is a story of a lot of the towns that you see after people established just their house to make sure they had shelter and food. One of the next things that was getting built was your religious institution of whichever faith that you practiced. This one is in German. Like I said, right in the southeastern part of the county, there was a lot of German immigration. So a lot of our first settlers were speaking German, specifically in Buffalo Grove, but in the Deerfield area as well, in the Long Grove area. And you were only learning English as a second language. And in fact, a lot of the settlers were working hard to sort of hold on to both languages, just like you see in lots of stories of people coming to this country today. You want to be able to speak English, but you also don't want to forget the culture that you grew up in.
Debbie, excuse me, I'm sorry. We had a question about the spinning wheel and the shoemaker kit.
Yes.
Was that part of a collection from the same family?
It was, in fact, oh, thank you. And I'm sorry, I did not see the question pop up, so definitely interrupt me. The spinning wheel and the shoemaking kit were 2 different families, but they both resided in Deerfield.
And then just at some point, will you be able to share the museums that participated in this collection?
Sure.
You said it was great. And we can email that to everybody once I get that from you.
Oh yes, it's a big list. We actually have a really cool brochure that lists all the museums and when they're open, just as soon as everybody is open again. So I'll send you guys that, because it also shows them all on a map. And so it makes it easy to think about. The early settlement was the 1830s and 40s. We're going to jump forward a little bit farther here. By the time the 1860s roll around, there are some towns in Lake County that are really well established. And once you're well established, you're not just thinking about food and shelter and the spinning wheel and the shoes. You're also starting to think about politics. And you're also starting to become important in politics enough for politicians to come up here and speak. And the most famous politician of all that did that was Abraham Lincoln. And what you are looking at here is in the collection of the Waukegan Historical Society. And it is the bed that Abraham Lincoln slept in when he went to Waukegan to give a political speech during his presidential campaign. It was in the house of the mayor, and it is indeed the bed that Lincoln slept in. And the story of Lincoln's speech gets even better because he was there campaigning, and the banner event of the evening was supposed to be his speech, and indeed he was in the middle of the speech giving it to a packed house when the fire horns went off for the volunteer fire department. And Lincoln watched about half the people in the audience become very uneasy because they were interested in the speech and also, but were volunteer firefighters. So literally from the podium said, don't you think you should all go get that? And about half the audience left, and he finished his speech, and then later on slept at the mayor's house, which is where this bed is from. And the mayor's family kept it and passed it down and eventually gave it to the Waukegan Historical Society. One of the other fun talks in that town was that Lincoln got a shave before he gave his speech, and the barber at the time would later say that he was in fact the last person to shave Lincoln before he grew a beard, which turned out to be not entirely accurate, but was indeed a fun thing to go on with. Not only was Lake County a place where the politicians would come to talk and Lincoln came to campaign, but the Civil War played a huge role in the development of the county and affected the county. And sometimes it's funny to think about because there were no Civil War battles in Illinois, and so you might not think that right around us was affected so much, but the toll of it was amazing because in Illinois at the time, basically 20% or more of the male population served in the Civil War. One out of every 5 people was gone to serve in the war, and of that they had over a 20% casualty rate, so a lot of people didn't come back. It was huge in how it affected the farms and the families and what happened both before and after. This right here is a piece of the stockade from Andersonville Prison that was brought back by a resident. You had both people who came back and didn't feel many effects at all, but you had plenty of people who came back who, if they were lucky, only got something amputated. And that was because that was actually considered one of the more successful surgeries, and they knew that 2 out of every 3 people who had an amputation would make it, and those were the odds that they were going for. So the Civil War was huge in affecting the people and basically also how Lake County thought of itself in relation to the rest of the world, because everybody had gone out and now seen the world, and you weren't just living in your town. You became very aware that your town and your community were connected to the rest of the country as well. The other thing that helped that was after the Civil War was when you especially saw the development of a lot of the train lines in the county, and transportation changes everything. This is the station sign from Gray's Lake. And so before the Civil War, you had some train lines that were going up the east side of the county, but afterwards, everybody seemed like they were getting on the train, and there were more than one train line that were competing. And this meant not only transportation for people the way we think of it now, but it was really important for the economy of all the farmers, because not only was the train growing, after the Civil War, immigration to Chicago continued to shoot up. Chicago was growing faster than anybody, which also meant they needed to be fed. And that was key for the farmers in this area, especially once the trains were developed. Now, not only could you grow stuff for yourself, but there was an immediate market for everything you were doing. So it was a good time to be a farmer here. You had one sign from the Grace Lake Station. Sometimes the trains helped everything develop. Sometimes the trains really helped a specific town develop. This is a North Shoreline button from Highwood, and a lot of Highwood was sort of built on the industry and the jobs provided by the North Shore train line, because there were garages there for the trains to get fixed. There was a switching station there. It was critical in developing the whole economy of the town.
Excuse me, Debbie, another question. Who built the train lines, and from where to where did they go?
Okay, I will go backwards for a second. The different companies sponsored them. And so the first ones basically think like basically think from Chicago to Milwaukee and all the towns in line that way. Western, they were aiming towards Elgin, the EJ&E, and Elgin is one of the important E's there, was one of them. They were also aiming out towards McHenry and Crystal Lake. And it's one of the reasons, the fact that companies would sponsor the train lines, different train lines, but then also you had to have people in town who were willing to sell land to the railroad company. And although that sounds like a no-brainer to us, the story of Grays Lake getting a train station only happened because of the farmers in town who owned the land that the train line wanted. 4 wanted to sell and 1 didn't. And so the train almost didn't come to Grays Lake until those 4 farmers got together and bought out the 5th farmer from the land so that they could get it developed. A very few of the train lines actually went out farther because of tourism industry. So in a little while, I'll talk about Fox Lake and Ravinia and how some of those towns were created to give people a reason to go out from there. So it's a couple different companies. The first ones were Chicago and Milwaukee, and then sort of going west out from that way. One of the other things that would happen at the train station is that is often where the local telegraph office was located. And that was the primary means of communication still at the time. So the trains were growing and the telegraph was the way people would talk. This is a telegraph key from the Deerfield train station. And we have that one because the man who worked there was a legendary telegraph operator who trained many of the other operators in other stations, and was famous for having survived a lightning strike. So the lightning actually hit the train station, traveled through the wires, blew him off his chair, and afterwards he picked himself up and checked his telegraph key and kept on sending, including news of the fact that there was bad weather in Deerfield at the time. So that was the communication at that time. And we talked about, told a little bit about the fact that the train lines would make it good for farmers. That was during the summer and the fall and the spring. The other thing that the train lines did that the farmers could do in the winter that we really don't think about as much anymore is there was an ice business in Lake County. So the different lakes got frozen and there was an ice business from the suburbs selling ice to Chicago. This was in Wakanda. This was in Lake Zurich. People would even cut ice on the Des Plaines River. And what you are looking at there is actually an ice plow that was used on frozen lakes. So the edges are very, very sharp, and that you would hook up your horse or your ox to the one end of the plow, and you would use that to score the ice chunks in the lake before you pulled them out, and would either store them in your ice house, or they would put them on train cars and ship them into the city. You've got those. You even have, and people, you know, for those of us who aren't used to cutting ice anymore, the idea of cutting chunks of ice and then trying to pull them out in the winter makes you wonder if things fell through. The Wakanda Historical Society has a really neat collection of ice tools that have been actually salvaged from the bottom of Bangs Lake. So yes, they did lose them every once in a while from people who were not experienced. As the towns grew, the farming towns grew, but also you began to get actual industry in Lake County. And industry needs transportation, and it also needs people and supplies. So the first place we got industry was in Waukegan. And one of the first industries there was from the Waukegan Corn Products Company. And this is actually a button from them, and I'll read it off just in case you guys can't see it. They pretty much made everything you can think of out of corn. So it was glucose, corn syrups, grape sugar, starch, corn oil, gluten feed, and germ meal. They made all of those, and they were a source of employment for immigrants who had come in. By this time, Lake County was a good place to live. It was also not a cheap place to live. So if you were looking to buy a farm and you were an immigrant who had come with very few resources, you needed a job first in order to earn enough money to have a farm and land of your own. And there were beginning to be industries in Waukegan that could supply that. The Corn Products Company is also the site of one of the worst industrial accidents in Illinois, because they had a lot of what they do, some of the dust is explosive. And so in 1919, they had a great explosion and fire that killed several people. The relationship between Chicago and the city continued to grow and change in some interesting ways. So Chicago was growing, and as it grew, we were feeding Chicago, we were giving them ice, we were using some of the immigrants who were coming and then maybe coming out to us to begin to work in the industry. But not surprisingly, the Chicago fire had a huge effect too. So what you see at the top there, those two white vases were actually salvaged from the Chicago fire. And it was two local volunteer firefighters from the Lake Bluff / North Chicago / Waukegan area, it wasn't that well defined then, had actually gone down to Chicago to help fight the Chicago fire. And as it was done, and as they were walking home, one of them noticed these two white vases had survived in the ashes. And so it was he and a friend who were both firefighting together. He picked them up out of the ashes, and each friend took one home to remember their experience fighting the fire. After the fire, when all the rebuilding was going on, that actually was a business bonus for some of the businesses in Lake County, which we don't see as much anymore. Right along near the Des Plaines River, there were different businesses that used clay. The bricks that you see here were actually from the Deerfield Brick Factory. Deerfield had a huge brick industry. Train car loads of bricks would go out of Deerfield every day. The slogan of the company was actually "a million a day we haul away." And the rebuilding of Chicago, with obviously wanting bricks instead of wood anymore, was great for the brick industry in Deerfield. They made tons of them. If you go, oh, sorry, hold on one second. If you go back a little if you go a little farther north, people were still making things out of clay. It was bricks, but also the thing you see on the lower part of the screen was drain tile for the new farms, and that was made up in Wadsworth. So we had brick and drain tile and sort of clay pipe industry all along, and it's neat because it helped to build the area, and it's also something you really don't see and think about anymore. It's a vanished industry from what we had. The big thing, though, for most of the county was food, and especially milk. There was a big dairy industry. There was a dairy industry almost all over. So the farmers were selling milk into the city. They were selling milk to the growing towns. You see bottles and a delivery crate from Lake Zurich Creamery Company, but there were creameries in Libertyville, in Palatine, in Waukegan, and they were both supplying local folks and also more regionally in Chicago. As we grew, they still needed more dairy, and we were close enough so that the dairy shipping worked. If you're wondering about the size, just comparatively speaking, most cows, even if you say it's a dairy farm, most farms were having about 5 to 10 cows. That's the average. We actually did the math, and cows give about 2 gallons of milk a day. But that does mean that you've got usually over 50 gallons of milk by the end of the week to deal with. So it was not the only way they made money, but it was a way that a lot of the farmers all over were making money. Now, once you made money, you got to improve your life. And I put this chair in there because you see some of the earliest things that I showed you that the farmers brought when they were coming on wagons or when they were coming from Germany, and you brought things that were either very practical or very precious. So you have the shoemaker's kit, you have the spinning wheel, you have the Bible. You had to pare it down. By this time, people were making more money and they were improving their houses. So this parlor chair is from the Cook house in Wakanda, and the Cook family there were one of the first families to actually get Wakanda started. So they did start out as a, one-room log cabin, grow your farm, grow your estate. As they grew and prospered, they actually built themselves a Victorian house in town and were able to have many rooms and very nice furniture. So this is Mary Cook's favorite chair from her parlor, and this is sort of what you grew into as the county grew and as you got more successful. You also have fun here. Not only can you have nicer furniture, you have nicer clothes too. This is fun. This is from Libertyville, and this is the wedding dress of Maybelle Peck, and she was one of the people who was instrumental in getting the Libertyville Library started. She was the sister-in-law of a Mr. Cook who was interested in libraries and thought, well, it might be a good idea for Libertyville, and she convinced him and his wife to later on leave their house to the city, and that was what the first library became. And in fact, not only was she good at talking to people about creating the library, she sat on the first library board, and she was one of the women in Libertyville who was instrumental in the suffrage movement. So she was encouraging people to read, and she was encouraging people to vote, and she helped manage the library when it got started. We talked about tourism a little bit earlier, and I want to talk about that more now because Lake County was important farm-wise because we were helping to feed Chicago, but as Chicago grew and got both more crowded and more polluted, people also started to want to get out of the city. And that became another reason the trains were important, is because that let people take a day trip out of the city. So what you are seeing here are a duck hunting boat from Fox Lake, which was a huge tourist area, even 100 years ago. You could take the train out, you could stay at hotels, you could just do regular things on the water, you could go hunting, or you could go fishing. That little duck at the bottom is a locally made bait for muskie fishing. So that was not, it wasn't a toy duck, it was actually for fishermen who were trying to catch muskies in Fox Lake and in the chain of lakes. So tourism was also an industry that was basically created by us having the train.
Debbie, excuse me, I'm sorry.
Yep.
Just going back to the library, what year was that started?
It was in the 19-teens.
Thank you.
The tourism in Fox Lake was hotels and fishing, but it was not, and while that was the one that people are perhaps most familiar with, that wasn't the only town that people went to, both for a day trip and also imagine it like staying a long weekend. This pitcher and salt and pepper shakers are souvenir china from Lake Zurich. So that was sold at the general store in Lake Zurich, and a lot, and Lake Zurich also had a tourism industry, both for people who would come out for the day and just enjoy a day in the fresh air at the lake. And they had little tourist cabins, so you could stay on the shore of the lake for the weekend. And the general store would sell you food in order to cook for yourself during the week, and they would also sell you souvenir china about your fun weekend in the country. Now, perhaps the most famous souvenir kinds of things were not in Fox Lake and not in Lake Zurich, but up in Antioch. And Antioch in that area was very, very famous for its lotus beds, and they were indeed spectacular. People would go out to see the lotus beds. They would gather armfuls of lotus flowers, and in any hotel you were staying at, and any shop, you would also see lotus perfume sold here. And the legend was, the story to the tourist was that this was the only place outside of Egypt that you could see real lotus flowers and get real lotus perfume. Now, an actual fact about the lotus perfume, that might have been a little bit of advertising, because one of the women who donated that actual bottle of perfume to the Historical Society there was the daughter of a hotel owner, and she remembered from her childhood, her dad would bring home a big gallon jug of perfume, and then it was the job of she and her sisters to fill up the little tiny bottles for the tourist trade.
Debbie, we had a question on the salt and pepper shakers. Were they actually made here in Lake County, or were they imported from somewhere else?
Those particular ones, the China part itself was imported. The painting job, the decoration part, was done here. So we have the towns that served as a resort area to start with, and then you also have Lake Bluff, which actually started as a summer resort. It was originally started as a Methodist camp summer resort for people who lived in Chicago, and then they would come out to Lake Bluff and have classes and have social opportunities with fellow Methodists, and that is the way the town started. But actually, as it grew and as people enjoyed the summer season there, they realized they didn't actually want to go home. It didn't feel like a camp. It felt like a good place to live all along. And it started to get converted into a permanent town. It also had a lot of organizations that were helpful social service organizations. It was the site of the Lake Bluff Chicago Homes for Children, which was an orphanage that actually lasted up until the early 1970s. So Lake Bluff also had an early resort history and then became a more permanent settlement. Ravinia, this is one of the very first ticket-taking boxes for the entrance of Ravinia Park. And so you can see it's called Ravinia Park Theater at the time, because its original sort of slate of programs was not just music like you see today. It was underwritten in part by the train companies who wanted to give people a stop to come out to. So there was music, there was also baseball and theater. There were dinner dances at Ravinia. Anything you could do in a big pavilion was something they were willing to let you try doing at Ravinia Park Theater. But that is one of the first ticket boxes from the park. One of the things that happens is as the towns develop more and you get people who want to be there year round and not just tourists, and you get more businesses, you also have to have more social services. So these are some fun examples of the social services as they start to grow in the towns, and a little bit of an example of how things have changed. What you see at the top is a wooden water pipe from Lake Bluff. So they developed, as they decided they wanted to be a permanent town, they also developed city water, but all the city water had wooden pipes. And so these were the pipes that were buried up underneath the street. I wish I could give you guys an idea of how big it was. We had to cut off the picture, but those pipe, just that chunk of the wooden water pipe that they have saved in the Historical Society is 8 feet long. So it's a huge artifact. And then down at the bottom, it's a little bit hard to see. It looks like a box because it is a box. It is literally the first post mailbox from the first postmaster in Libertyville. This was the one box you would put your mail into. The postmaster would gather all the mail and then distribute all the mail. And it doesn't look very big because Libertyville wasn't that big right at the time, but it's the beginning of thinking about yourself not just as a farmer, but as a whole town, and what a town needs to keep its people happy and to get more residents.
Debbie, just back, I'm sorry, I hate to keep interrupting you. Back to the post office, did people put stamps on those letters?
They would. A town also needs fun. So what you see here, and a county needs fun. So what you see here is something that was fun for the tourists, but also just fun for the local residents. This is souvenir glass from the Lake County Fair in 1903. At that time, the fair was held in Libertyville, and it had a lot of the things we still think of as far as a county fair goes. So it had animals, and it had exhibits, and it had rides. But the real reason you also wanted to go to the county fair at that time is it had horse racing. And it was in fact one of the only places in Northern Illinois that you could see horse racing. They had a lot of different horse racing throughout the whole extent of the fair. Gambling officially? No. Gambling in practice? Absolutely. As we get a little bit more modern, we still have growing towns and some more of the things that people come for and stay for. So what you see at the top is the trunk that was used by Jack Benny when he was living in Waukegan and part of the vaudeville theater circuit with another lady named Cora. And as they had just a musical duo, this was before Jack Benny became famous and before it was when he was really still playing the violin as a violin act, but this was the trunk they used when they were traveling around on the vaudeville circuit. To the left, you see a bottle from Beasley's Brewery in Waukegan, which was a local brewery that supplied people all the way up through Prohibition. It's real beer still in the bottle. They haven't touched it. And then at the bottom, pre-shopping centers, towns had different department stores, and this box is from the Globe department store in Waukegan, which was one of the premier department stores in Waukegan for nearly 70 years from the downtown.
Debbie, 2 more questions. Back to the Lake County Fair. Was that glass made in Lake County, or was it made elsewhere and then the same as the china?
Like the china, it was made elsewhere and engraved here.
And so we had a vaudeville circuit here locally?
Yes. Specifically at, there were one, two, three different theaters in Waukegan. That would be the biggest place. They were the big theaters. You would also have huge vaudeville, and think of it not just vaudeville, but theater acts at Chevy Chase Country Club in Wheeling. They actually drew a lot of very big name acts. Hume Croynan and Jessica Tandy, the two actors, they both performed there as well. Those are the immediate ones that leap to mind. I mean, it wasn't a little circuit, but people would stop here on the whole circuit that they performed. We're also, one of the things that I wanted to talk about was the military, because the military and the different bases in the area did indeed have an effect on the development of Lake County in different areas as well. What you see here are both from Great Lakes. The button on the left is actually from 1911, it is from the opening celebration of Great Lakes as a naval training station. It only pretty much had one building and a couple of barracks. It's still called building number 1. That's the building you see there. The Secretary of Defense came to the meeting. I believe the Vice President was also actually at the opening ceremonies for Great Lakes. And so it's been a naval training station since 1911. It really grew into its prominence during World War II. And at that time, literally the day of Pearl Harbor, the man who was in charge of sort of buildings and operations at Great Lakes immediately knew what a significant thing this was and got permission from the commander of the base to begin expanding the facility even before the official declarations came out, because he knew how many people would be coming and how key the facility would be. Before World War II was done, over 1 million sailors would have been trained at Great Lakes. And I did a little math just for a different program I did. Basically, that would mean about 468 new sailors every single day for 4 years in a row coming to Lake County to go and be trained at Great Lakes. And after that, they would go out and into the war effort. Now, some of the most famous ones at Great Lakes included the Golden 13, which were the first African-American Navy recruits to become officers. And we added this football here because this was an integrated winning Navy football team during 1943, who included some of those officers who would become part of the Golden 13, as well as other men who would go on to be college football stars. So we wanted to put a little bit of that in there too.
We've noticed that there's been a lot of buttons from various slides that you've shown. What is the significance of those buttons? Why did so many companies or the military, what was the deal with the buttons?
A little bit of it is practical. One of the reasons that there are buttons was in the beginning, just like now, buttons were an easy thing for people to manufacture and to distribute for political causes, for special events, for company-wide things. It was something that you could make a lot of for not that much money. And you can get, they last, they feel solid when you get them, and you can get neat graphics on them. And then the other part would just be my suspicion as a person who's been working in museums over 20 years. We only have what people save and give us, and buttons are a very easy thing to collect and save, and they don't take up too much space. So it's something that people have kept around for a long time and then are able to give to us. What you have here is sort of the next era of history in in Lake County, and something we're all maybe more familiar with, which would be the growth of the suburbs. So post World War II, the thing that really affected the county and the growth of the county was the GI Bill and VA loans. And so even though we had the transportation with the train lines, even though we had industry in Waukegan and in the farms and the tourism industry, what really affected and created the county that we see today would be the GI Bill and VA loans. These artifacts are both from Buffalo Grove, and we are probably one of the towns that are the prime example of a post-World War II growth spurt. In 1958, Buffalo Grove had 164 residents. It was a farm town, blink and you miss it. At that time, everyone else around was starting to get filled up, and construction changed so people could make housing more quickly. And the soldiers who had gone to school on the GI Bill were getting out and getting good jobs and able to get a VA loan, so it was ripe for development. The suit on the left was worn by a local resident to visit her husband on his leave during the middle of the Korean War. It was the first time she left the country. She actually got on a ship to sail, and she met him in Japan, and this was the suit she wore when she stepped off the boat. And she said she's glad the suit was green because she had been so seasick on the way over that really she lost weight before she got off the boat to see everybody. But this was the suit she wore to see him. Once he got out of the service, they bought a house in Buffalo Grove and have lived there 50 years since. She was able to give us that suit. The toolbox is from Levitt and Sons Builders, from the Levitt Homes development. And in the case of Buffalo Grove, Levitt Homes this was one of their ventures into Illinois, where you build a lot of homes very quickly. The prices were more than reasonable and people were more than willing to buy. As far as Levitt goes, they actually sold out the entire, in the beginning of Buffalo Grove, one development was actually sold out in literally 2 weeks. The first development, the first weekend they offered things for sale, half the homes got sold. The next week, everything cost $1,000 more per house, and the rest of the houses got sold. But they knew that this was the very first home ownership for lots and lots of people. So when you bought your house, you were actually given a toolbox with it filled with tools to be able to fix your house. And so I said it was an example of a growth spurt in Buffalo Grove. We went from having 164 people to having 10,000 people in less than 10 years. So it was a very, very fast growth rate. One of the things then is you still have more fun things to do. So these are all just fun things. The bowling pin is from the first bowling alley in Buffalo Grove. It was actually founded by an ex-Chicago Bear, Rick Caceres, who used his football retirement money to found the bowling alley, and at first got a lot of grief because at that time people said, a bowling alley on Dundee Road, that's out in the middle of nowhere. Who will ever come to that? But not only then, even though Buffalo Grove was still small and growing, it became very popular because it was a bowling alley. You could also get food there. So they had a restaurant attached. And on weekends, there was a little bit of a band, so there could be dancing. And if you didn't want that, you could go to the drive-in theater. This drive-in theater speakers are from Grays Lake, from the drive-in movie theater there. Or if you still wanted to drive in the country, you could go apple picking. And these are from Bell's Apple Orchard out in Wakanda. No matter what we're talking about, all of this happened not just because one farmer did well or one person did well. Different people had different ideas, but the whole point of all of this is that the communities grew because people were working together. And I've got this quilt here because this is just one fun example of it. This is not just a crazy quilt, it's a signature quilt. Each of those pieces has a signature on it, either in stitching or in pen. And it was used as a fundraising quilt in Libertyville. So it was a combination of women from 4 different churches who were working together to fundraise for a community building and created this quilt to be raffled off at auction. And so I wanted to leave people with that thought and with this thought, because the Polaroid camera is not just an image, it is an actual artifact that was used by a newspaper reporter in Wakanda. And like many people, both then and today, he had more than one job. He ran a local restaurant as well as being the photographer for the local paper for over 20 years. And everything you saw here, everything the history museums do is because we have people who think about history and talk about history and then donate artifacts to the museum. So we don't get to share stories until you share stories with us. So please think about that now and in the future. If ever you're wondering if we're interested in your stories, the answer is always yes.
Debbie, thank you so much for joining us. This was really very, very interesting. And if you can send me the brochure for the museums that were included in this presentation, I'll be happy to send it out to everybody by email once you send it.
So absolutely, thank you. If anyone has any questions now, I'd be happy to take them. If not, I know this was a long time to sit still and look at a computer screen. So I appreciate your time and thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you, everybody.